So last week we said goodbye to King Nebuchadnezzar, and he seemingly finished well, didn't he? He had a tumultuous journey, but at the end there, finally surrendered to the Lord. And so when we see him in heaven, we'll be able to say, "Whew, that was close." Nebi, you really had a questionable life. But that's a picture of many of our journeys. We've all had a difficult challenge, maybe, or had a challenging life, and we've had a very personal experience with God as He's kind of brought us into finally bringing us into surrender. And for some people, that's a very theatrical, dramatic journey. For others, it was a relatively straightforward journey. But we all have a different story, and Nebuchadnezzar is just an example of that. So we're in chapter 5. This chapter is like the final scene in a movie. It's really exciting. The Babylonian dynasty was about 400 years. And here, with what we're going to read in chapter 5, it's a snapshot of the events that take place in the last night of the Babylonian Empire before they will collapse. So we're going to be going through a few of the events that unfolded in this night. The final night of the Babylonian Empire. Let's just jump straight in here. Chapter 5, verse 1. King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Okay, let's stop there. Already this is interesting. So we're introduced to Babylon's new king, King Belshazzar. Not to be mistaken for Belteshazzar, which was Daniel's Babylonian name. It's Belshazzar, slightly different, one less syllable there, but it is good for me to draw that to your attention. Now, chapter 5 has actually come under a lot of criticism. I've mentioned a few times some of the polemic views and criticism of chapter 5, of the book of Daniel. And chapter 5 is an interesting example of it, and is a catalyst for why people have casted doubt over the historical accuracy of the book of Daniel, or of the Bible in general. And the main reason for that is because up until recently, as in the past 100 years or so, there were no historical records of a king Belshazzar. And I say up until recently because recently there's been the discovery of ancient literature which has attested for such a king, which is encouraging for us because knowing that the Bible is historically accurate, looking at the claims of the Bible and seeing them be corroborated and reconciled with ancient manuscripts is a confirmation that this is God's word. So after King Nebuchadnezzar died, he had two sons that fought for the throne for about 7 years. They went back and forth, and they were kind of switching out, and they battled for the throne for quite some time, about 7 years. And then finally, a man called Nabonidus, who was not of the royal bloodline, he takes the throne, and he will become the next permanent king. And he's not of the royal bloodline. He's not a child of Nebuchadnezzar. And so to legitimize his place as king, he decides to marry one of Nebuchadnezzar's daughters. And that would somehow make it appropriate that he is now reigning as king. So Nabonidus, who's going to be the new king here, is a son-in-law to Nebuchadnezzar. And history teaches us, and there's plenty of manuscripts on this, that Nabonidus was enthroned as king in 556 BC. So he's the king, but he's not the king we're going to be talking about. Now, when he became king, he very quickly became an absent king. He abandoned his duties, he abandoned the city, he abandoned the people, and he went vacationing, in particular, to Arabia. He went and worshipped the moon god, and so he forsook his responsibilities as king and was known as an absent king. And so as a result of that, as a result of him being a neglectful king and really not doing his job, he makes his son, Belshazzar. He's going to make him a co-regent of the kingdom. So Belshazzar was, in fact, a king of the Babylonian Empire. A lot of archaeology and discovery of these manuscripts have confirmed these two guys, Nabonidus, well, of course, Nebuchadnezzar, Nabonidus, and Belshazzar. So as we read through this final night for Babylon, our main character is this gentleman called King Belshazzar. So the Babylon's final night, it begins with a feast. And let's keep reading here in verse 2. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, and that the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, out of the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Okay, let's pause there. I do have to just say, you noticed it said, and of the silver, and Nebuchadnezzar, his father. The Hebrew word, or in this case Aramaic, the Aramaic and Hebrew word for father can be grandfather or father, so it is referring to his grandfather, so don't be distracted by that if you picked up on it. And now, thanks to antiquity, in particular the Babylonian Chronicle, we can actually determine the exact date that this took place, when this feast, this party is taking place. It is Saturday, it's a Saturday night, October 12th, 539 BC. We know this because this is when Cyrus entered and defeated Babylon without a fight. And we'll get to that soon. The historian Herodotus writes that the events that took place when Cyrus attacked was a night that it was a time of festival and feast and fun. So Belshazzar, he is throwing quite an elaborate party. And there's a lot of historic records that tell us what these parties looked like. They were quite an event. The culture knew how to throw a party. Now, verse 1 even gives us a real sense. There was 1,000 of his lords were present. That's not including a lot of other people, wives, concubines, and others. I've never thrown a party for 1,000 people. Have any of you? No, this is a big party, right? So it was unlikely a black tie event. It was unlikely a group of people conducting themselves like gentlemen. It probably looked more like a frat party than it did anything else. I mean, they're worshiping all sorts of gods, and these gods, the way they want to be worshipped is by acts of debauchery. So this feast was not a classy affair. Verse 2 says that Belshazzar, he tasted the wine. Well, that's when all the trouble began. The first thing he decides to do is, let's go get all the gold and silver vessels from this Jewish god. Let's go get them and let's drink out of them. So that's when his disregard and dishonor to God began. And of course, these are the objects, you remember, right? Chapter 1, I think verse 1 of chapter 1, or verse 2 maybe, when Nebuchadnezzar took all the vessels from the Jewish temple. These are these very things that his grandfather had taken. So he gets them in verse 4. They drank wine out of them and praised the gods of silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. It feels like a really brazen and rude and blasphemous thing to do, right? And then, I don't know if you picked up when it said gods of silver, bronze, iron, gold, wood, and stone. Where have we seen those materials before? Right? Chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar's dream, the statue. And so I think that this is an allusion to that, and speaking of the worship of man-made gods. Okay, so it was in the middle of all this fun, all this pagan festivities, that Belshazzar received a terrifying message. And let's read here from verse 5. So they're drinking, they're having fun, he's showing off to all his friends. Verse 5, immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. Then the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. The king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. The king declared to the wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck and shall be third ruler in the kingdom." Then all of the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his lords were perplexed. So it's during this elaborate party, he's having some drinking, there's drinking, and they're having a great time, and a disembodied hand appeared and writes a cryptic message on the palace wall. This is an extraordinary event. What are we to imagine? Our minds are all going somewhere with this, right? Was there a pen in the hand? Like, how did this, or did the finger of this disembodied hand just kind of sketch into the plaster of the wall? How big was this hand? Well, we don't know, and it leaves a lot for our imagination. I can't get out of my head that creepy hand from Adam's Family. Is that what it is? Are you all imagining that? And in verse 6, this might be the funniest verse, the funniest part of this whole story. Then the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. So this is frightening. I don't know if you're imagining that. I feel like I've seen Goofy do that, where his knees are knocking together out of fear, right? I don't know if you're imagining that some kind of Elvis kind of moves or something like that. But he is having a severe physiological reaction to the fear that he's feeling. In fact, a lot of translators say that in the original language, it actually speaks more of he lost control of his bodily functions. So that's how terrifying this moment is for the king. And losing control of your bodily functions in front of 1,000 of your lords is not your proudest moment for him, right? Sure, he was very embarrassed. So he's having this terrifying experience. But not to worry, his crack squad of magicians will be called upon. And they've been wildly unsuccessful every time these guys have been called upon, haven't they? And he even gives them the incentive of a promotion. You know, they'll get a robe and gold and third in command. That's quite the promotion. So let's read what happens here in verse 10. Because they're unable to do it. Is that a surprise to anyone, by the way? We're all surprised that the wise men yet again couldn't do it. They couldn't do it in chapter 2 with the statue. They couldn't do it in chapter 4. They couldn't do it again here, so we really shouldn't be surprised. But not to worry. Let's read here in verse 10. The queen shows up. The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banqueting hall. And the queen declared, "O king, live forever," which is a common phrase to basically say, I'm in your corner. I'm with you, right? "O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you or your color change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him." We all know who he's talking about, right? This is Daniel. "And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers, because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret the dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation." So the queen, and that is either Belshazzar's mom or his wife, we're not sure who it is, reminded him of Daniel, the one who is going to be able to get to the bottom of this for him. So after looking to the world's wisdom to try and solve this puzzle, and it didn't work out, the world was unable to give him insight on this spiritual issue, he calls upon Daniel. Now, Daniel is about 83 years old now. He's an older gentleman. It seems like he wasn't, for whatever reason, he wasn't invited to the party. He wasn't there. They had to call upon him. Or maybe he was invited to the party, and 83-year-olds aren't in the mood to party and drink. Maybe that was the reason. Maybe he didn't want to miss Jeopardy. I don't know. He wasn't there, right? And just as with the magicians, Daniel is offered the same reward, the robes, third in command. However, Daniel declines this. Verse 17, then Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. It's worth noting why that offer of being third in command was a relatively meaningless offer for him. One, like I mentioned, he's an older gentleman, and probably the idea or being privileged to be third in command is probably a burden that he really didn't want. Secondly, he probably knew that the kingdom was about to fall. Being third in command of an empire that's going to collapse in a few hours is hardly a gig worth getting, and he likely knew that. And so before Daniel interprets and explains the writing on the wall, while he's talking with King Belshazzar, the writing is on the wall. Before he handles that, before the Lord speaks to him on that, he's going to talk directly to King Belshazzar in verse 22. Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this, but you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold and bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. I like this. He just rebukes them. Now, there's an old saying that says history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. Right? This is true. Don't you feel like we've seen this before? Isn't this the same interaction that we've seen time and time again throughout the book of Daniel, especially with Nebuchadnezzar? The same is true here. Babylon is just steeped with kings who are just committed to their pride and their idolatry. So he confronts the king for desecrating the holy vessels. He confronts the king for idolatry and reminds him that his pride and his arrogance have dishonored the one who gave him breath in his lungs. So after being direct with him, he decides to interpret the message on the wall. Verse 25. And this is the writing that was inscribed. Mene, mene, tekel, and parsin. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. 28. Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple and chain of gold and was put around his neck. And a proclamation was made about him that he should be third ruler of the kingdom, which we know Daniel's not thrilled about. Verse 30, that very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Okay, let's talk about this message here. So the words written on the wall were mene, mene, tekel, parsin. These are Aramaic words. Now, I'm not sure exactly why the wise men, why they couldn't interpret this. Aramaic is the language of the day. These guys speak Aramaic. Why couldn't they read it? We're not entirely sure. Scholars suggest that there might have been some interpretive challenges that prohibited them from interpreting it. For example, there is a version of Aramaic that has no consonants, and it has no vowels, it only has consonants. And so it may have been a challenge to read clearly what is being said. Maybe there were no spaces, maybe it was written vertically, maybe it was written backwards. There was something about the way it was presented where these wise men couldn't figure it out. So when Daniel reads the words the first time, when he reads them in the noun form. And the Aramaic meaning of these words are basically they're like weights and measurements. But when he interprets it, he uses it in the verb form. And this might not be overly meaningful, but it just is kind of the backdrop of what's going on with this interpretation. And the message is this: Belshazzar and the Babylonian kingdom, their days are numbered, they're weighed and divided. That's the message. His days have been numbered. That is to say, this kingdom and Belshazzar, you have a shelf life. Your days are numbered. And this kingdom has been weighed in the balances. It's been analyzed here. It's been weighed, and it has been found wanting. And his kingdom had been divided. Possibly an allusion to being divided between the Persians and the Medes. Numbered, weighed, and divided. Ultimately declaring the end of the Babylonian Empire. The invincible city of Babylon is about to fall. The king has failed to humble himself to the Lord, and Babylon and the king, they have served God's purposes. So let me make a couple of quick comments here about the fall of Babylon. It shouldn't be a surprise that Babylon was about to fall. This had been clearly laid out in chapter 2 with Nebuchadnezzar's dream, right? That was the point of it, is that we're going to go from one empire to the next. In fact, not to mention, in Isaiah chapter 47, verse 1, feel free to check this, it's kind of cool, this was prophesied. The fate of Babylon was prophesied by Isaiah. King Belshazzar, he's the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. He knew about his grandfather's encounters with God. He knew what was said to him. He knew that the empire was going to come to an end. That was the point of the interpretation of chapter 2's dream. The surrounding cities around Babylon have likely fallen to the Persians and the Medes. And Babylon was the final stand, the last city. So this message likely came as no surprise to Belshazzar. Maybe he had a sense what that message on the wall was about, which is why it terrified him. He knew, maybe, is tonight the night? After 400 years of this dynasty, tonight we go down? Maybe Belshazzar did know this, and this was the motivation for this festival. Maybe just do a bunch of worship, try and placate the gods. Maybe they'll throw him a bone. Maybe he knew tonight he was going to die, and so he drank to get courage or drank to dull the fear. We don't know for sure what he did and didn't know. Now, from the world's perspective, Babylon is an unlikely city to be conquered. It was the most fortified city in the world. Nebuchadnezzar had done a wonderful job insulating Babylon from her enemies, right? He'd done well with that. But it was surrounded by a wall, about 55 miles in total. That's a big old wall, right? It was 300 feet high and 80 feet wide. This is not easy to penetrate this city. In fact, they'd also redirected the Euphrates River to send water to create a moat around the outside of the wall as another layer of defense. So how on earth were they conquered? Well, according, again, to the historian Herodotus, Cyrus the Persian king, he dammed the river, the Euphrates River, about a mile and a half. upstream, he dammed it and rerouted it to a lake, causing the river to dry up. And we know this through history. This drained the moat that was around the city, allowing the Persians and the Medes to crawl under the wall and gain access to the city. And this is all happening when Belshazzar and his friends are having a good old time. They're drinking, they're partying. Meanwhile, the enemy is coming in. And so this final verse here marks the end of not only Belshazzar, but also the great city of Babylon. Verse 30, that very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom. This is the transition from the head of gold to the chest and arms of silver. This is that very moment. It didn't even happen, it didn't even kind of happen kind of phasing transition. It happened acutely, right in that moment. God is ushering in the Medo-Persian Empire. So after just talking through those events, just looking about what kind of happened in that last night, you've got King Belshazzar, he's throwing a party. We've got the enemy coming in. There was a message on the wall, a cryptic message on the wall. Belshazzar has an adverse reaction to that message on the wall. Daniel comes in. He tells him exactly what this means. And while this is all going on, the enemy has come in without a fight. I was tempted to, you could see where I was tempted to go on this about how easy it is if we're, goofing off, having fun, not thinking about the things of God, how easily the enemy can take us. I was going to go there, but I thought I'm going to go a different direction. But there's so much we can learn from this. But after watching these events of Belshazzar's party and seeing the collapse of the Babylonian Empire, I want to draw your attention to just one thing. Usually I try to have like 3 points because I feel like you've come all the way to church. I should probably tell you 3 things that are somewhat meaningful. You're sitting through this. But today, I only have one thing that I want to put on your hearts and in your minds for you to think about. That is this. The world has been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Babylon is an example of the best that the world has to offer. It's powerful. It's beautiful, famous, wealthy, functional. Nebuchadnezzar had streets and there was beauty, there was the hanging gardens. Things were pretty much paved with gold because gold was just in abundance in Babylon. They had power, they had notoriety, they were significant on the world stage. Babylon is an example of the best that the world has to offer. And they played their hand at things like sexual freedom and liberty, drinking and fun for all. And then with what we assume is God's hand, he writes on the wall and says, Babylon's glory, all of that, it's been weighed and it's found wanting. In all its glory, in all that splendor, it is inferior and inadequate to manifest spiritual things. And by the world's standard, it is tremendous. It is attractive, and it's truly a great city. By every metric, by every worldly metric, Babylon was remarkable. Yet, the aggregate of its splendor was unremarkable before God. Babylon and her kings are the quintessential example of the cheap, worthless things of this world. God weighed the best that man has to offer, and God said, yeah, it's found lacking. Doesn't matter how rich, how cultured and educated it wasn't enough. And nothing has really changed. That's true for our culture. Now, we've advanced in many ways, and we've come a long way. But we don't want to conflate scientific and technological progress for spiritual and moral progress. Because the world's brilliance and all its glory, like it was back in Babylon and like it is today, is still being weighed and is found lacking. In Ecclesiastes, Solomon describes it this way in verse 14, chapter 1. I have seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and is striving after wind. So, church, any pursuit that does not have the aim of the furtherance of God's plan is merely just chasing after the wind. Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar and Babylon, all that they did, they were busy chasing the wind. That's a good reminder for us. It's a really good reminder that we don't need to feel inclined or drawn or curious about the things of the world. We know that it's worthless. I'm not saying that the beauty of this world isn't, good, and trees are beautiful and people are wonderful and things that exist in this world are not innately ugly, but they have no significance to bringing peace and freedom and spiritual hope. And it's so important that we need to know that, because it tries to tell us, it has a different narrative. The world is trying to say to you, hey, this is awesome. You should be this. You should do that. It flirts with you. It's flaunting. It's like, hey, it's trying to charm you, to tell you this world is awesome. You should dabble in it a little bit. And you know what? When our guard is down and we are not focused, we can show interest in folly. And this world, it does a great job announcing itself. The world is like a donut store next to the gym. It's just a distraction that renders no positive results. It's not a great analogy, but in Matthew 16, verse 26, for what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? It's a shame Belshazzar and Nebuchadnezzar never read that. Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? Church, there is nothing more valuable than your walk with God. There is nothing more valuable than your soul and your spiritual condition. That's your prized possession. And to trade that is the epitome of foolishness. James describes our relationship with the world in no uncertain terms in chapter 4, verse 4. You adulterous people, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? You can't dabble in both. It's an either or. Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. It's good for us. It's good for us believers to be reminded that we're not of this world. And that it is never good to trade out the spiritual virtues, the spiritual qualities, to trade out these things for the things of this world. It's never good, but it's tempting. Judas, he sold out Jesus for a few pieces of silver. Esau sold his birthright for, of all things, stew, food. And of course, David, he traded out his integrity to gratify a lust of the flesh. It's not worth it. But that's what the world offers to us. But the world has been weighed and it's found lacking. And I read through this whole chapter, and even just reading about the Babylonian Empire is just that perfect example of the world's best. And God is saying, I've looked at it. its days are numbered, first of all. And when I weigh it, when I hold it all in the balance, yeah, there's nothing substantial there. That's important for us to know because we are part of, obviously, God's kingdom, but we exist in this world and we're trying to kind of navigate our way through it, and things pop up, right? Little temptations or little inclinations. And so then we trade out certain things, like we forsake certain things, like maybe our commitment to our family or our commitment to God's people or something, to go after something like wealth and fame or something. And God is saying, don't trade out spiritual things for that, because I've actually weighed that. And if you're curious, it's worthless and it's found wanting. It's insufficient. And in 1 John chapter 2, it says, do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. I hope you get the picture. The world is vying for our attention. There is a lot about it that is shiny. There's a lot about it that draws us in. And when we look at Babylon and when we look at Belshazzar and we look in this moment where Daniel looks at that message on the wall and then he says to Babylon, you want to know what that means? It means it all amounts to nothing. And you went after it your whole life. I'm going to invite the worship team up. I think you get the picture here that this world is like clouds without water, right? It's the promise of something it can't produce. And arguably, the greatest deception in life is to believe that you're gaining something valuable when you're actually losing something eternal. That is the most tragic thing that can happen in your life. There is no sadder reality for you to hold and possess everything that God has for you. He's given you the gift of salvation. He's given you gifts. He's given you blessing. He's given you promises. He's given you his word. He's revealed himself, and he's asking you to walk in obedience to that. And that is just a wonderful thing, because it's the only thing in this world that's going to bring about peace, going to bring about purpose, going to bring hope, going to make sense of this whole thing. That's been issued to us. And how sad is it that we might forget that and then go dabble in some other things? I've spoken to men who have been unfaithful to their wife and to their family, and they just lamented it and just said, for a second, it just seemed like the right thing. It seemed like the good thing. It seemed like something I actually wanted, and it was found lacking. And it came at a tremendous cost. This whole last point was actually meant to be really encouraging, and it feels like a rebuke. So, this is amazing that you and I are part of God's kingdom, and we're not part of a world that can't deliver. We are a part, in our relationship with God, God can deliver on all his promises. His promises are yes and amen, and they are reliable. They are everything that we need and should put our hope in. And so I hope you feel really encouraged today in your faith and in your walk to know I am on Team Jesus. I am not a part of this world, and that is good, because the world keeps on trying to tell me that I picked the wrong team. But be reminded that that team, the world, there is a message on that wall, and we know what it means, and it says, I've weighed it, and it is found lacking. So as we finish chapter 4 here and we reflect on Belshazzar, may we be reminded of the emptiness of this life, and more importantly, the richness and the beauty and the joy to a life surrendered to God. And I hope that energizes and excites your heart, that we are not of this world and we are not missing out. So may we maintain that loyalty and that faithfulness to Christ, who is the true bread of life. Let's pray. Well, Lord, as we look at this piece of history, we go back 2,500 years and we look at just one evening, just one night, maybe just a few hours. And it represents so much. The Babylonian Empire was nothing. And that God, it has nothing to offer this world, and may we all hold that deeply within our hearts and our minds. May we not be distracted. May we not think that we can kind of traverse between our obedience to you and then our inclinations in this world. May we live faithful for you. May we throw off sin, put on righteousness. May we repent when we do things wrong. God, would you lead us? And as we walk in that faithfully, we anticipate and we look forward to the blessing and the joy and the peace and all that comes with being in right standing with you. And so we thank you for that in Jesus' name. Amen. Church, you may stand as we close in a song.